all three of those things, your character, your presence, and your intellect, are something that you have to reassess on a daily basis. When you look at the second element, your competencies, it's how do you lead? How do you communicate? How do you do things? How do you walk among people? So those 6 areas out of those 2 elements of attributes and competencies to me are very important. But they require, Tom, a continuous self-assessment.
Welcome to the Science of Leadership, the podcast dedicated to helping you become a better leader. Here, you'll gain valuable knowledge, hear inspiring stories, and learn the scientific principles that promote exceptional leadership. I'm Tom Collins, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you join us on this journey to becoming a better leader. I'm delighted today to be joined by Lieutenant General Mark Hertling. General Hertling is a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point. He was the commanding general of the United States Army Europe. He fought in 3 wars, was awarded multiple medals, and those included 4 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart. After retiring from the Army, he moved into the healthcare space, and he completed a doctorate in business administration. As part of that, he ended up writing a book, Growing Physician Leaders. It's in the top 100 of the hundreds of leadership books that I've read, and I'm sure that you'll get a lot out of it. General, thank you for being on the show, and I really appreciate that. I also appreciate your service to our nation.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Collins. Really appreciate it. And please call me Mark for the rest of the show if you don't mind.
Yes, sir. I'll do my best. It's hard, former military, we tend to hold fast to that, but yes, sir, we'll do. I like to define terms. So, we're planning on talking about moving military leadership into medicine and healthcare, but I wanted to try to get you to help us define this term, military leadership.
Well, first, what I'd say is the Army that I'm familiar with has a manual, a leadership field manual called 6-22. It's actually an Army reference pamphlet, but it defines leadership in the very first chapter. And it says that it's the process of influencing people to accomplish a mission and improve an organization by providing purpose, direction, and motivation. Now you could say, okay, well, that's an Army definition. It's very succinct. It's one sentence. But when you really break that down a little bit, Tom, it describes all leadership. There is no such thing as military leadership. There is leadership, and then there is not leadership, I guess. Sure. I would say. So when you're talking about defining what leadership is, what I'd suggest is through both experience and my research. Mm-hmm. And I did a lot of research for my doctorate specifically on healthcare leadership. Leadership consists of 4 things. If you are a leader, you have certain characteristics or attributes. Mm-hmm. You have, number 2, certain competencies, things that you can do. And that spans the spectrum from communicating to building teams to running an organization like a hospital. Number 3, it's influence techniques. How do you influence others to do what needs to be done for the organization or for you? And we can talk all about the different theories of leadership, but truthfully, it's really about influencing others to do something. And that's stated in the Army definition. And by the way, I'll get to this in a second, but the 4th thing is context. How do you lead in a specific environment, in a specific organization, with the culture of the organization, with the rules that have been put on you, with the expectations of you as a leader? So those 4 areas of attributes, competencies, influence methods, and context are things I always look for when I talk about what leaders do and how they do it.
Wow, that's excellent. So much there to dive into. The first thing I would say is I agree with you 100%. That definition, that Army definition in Field Manual 6-22, another great book that I recommend to any of our listeners. I read it multiple times. It's superb. But it has no reference to the United States military. It is simply, agnostic with regard to that. And I think that it is, as you say, very succinct, typical of military language, but it delivers such a punch and is really great. So I agree. And that reality of leadership is, I think, really important when we start thinking about leading in any sort of manner, that it's not
Yeah.
necessarily Army or healthcare per se, but it is, as you were saying, these attributes and influence techniques and the context and so forth.
Well, if I could, Tom, I have problems with two words in that Army definition. And I made this known to my Army hierarchy when I was part of the Training and Doctrine Command. And those two words are, well, let me state the definition again. It's the process of influencing people to accomplish a mission and improve an organization by providing purpose, direction, and motivation. The two words that I have problems with, and as you can tell, I've memorized that
Yes, sir.
definition. The two words that I have problems with are process of influencing people, and the last one is providing motivation. Leaders don't provide motivations. Motivation is internal to the lead. It is how you feel about doing or not doing something. The only thing leaders can provide is influence of your motivation, helping you to understand what your motivations are and how they might change in order to contribute to the greater glory of the team. The process word really, I think, is kind of inclusive in this definition because it's not really a process of influencing people. It is the elements that contribute to influence people. And that gets down to who the leader is and what the leader does and how they do it. So I don't consider that, trying to make precise words addressing the situation. I don't see those as processes. I see those as internal elements to the leader, him or herself.
The motivation thing, if I remember correctly, you were a swimmer. Am I remembering that right?
I was, yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So you were a swimmer, and if you could think back to your time of being a swimmer, did your coach motivate you?
Well, we didn't talk about this, but I'm glad you used the swimmer analogy because I can put it very succinctly. There were days, of the thousands of swim practices that I went to where we were chasing walls back and forth and doing it at different times and different sets of swim technique. You come into a practice with your own internal motivation. Hey, I'm really going to use these next 2 hours to do something that will build my strength, that will build my skills as a swimmer, that will help me beat the competitors. So those are internal motivations. The coach can only influence you depending on how you feel coming into the practice. If you're always upbeat, and ready to go, and you have your game plan all charged up, the coach says, okay, get in the water and let's go. If you come in and you've had a bad night's sleep or a long night of study or you're just not feeling well, your motivation is down. So your coach has to change the way that he or she influences you to ensure you get the motivation. Hey, Mark, I know you're feeling bad because you just got a letter from your girlfriend that wasn't too great, but let's put that aside and let's remember what our goals are. Our goals are to win the NCAA championship, and our goals are only met if you give every day everything you've got in these practices and focus on a specific area of your swimming skill set. See, that's how you influence. But you can't change the motivation, or you don't establish the motivation. You can, adjust to it and adapt to it if you're trying to influence someone else. And every piece of research study, Tom, about leadership really focuses on influence techniques as opposed to external motivation. Because if you talk to psychiatrists and psychologists, they'll tell you there is no such thing as external motivation. That's all internal to the human.
Sure.
And I hate to get bogged down in this, but I think this is an important subject for people to realize, because as a leader, if you're trying to influence your team to do something, you can't use a one-size-fits-all approach.
Right.
You really have to understand the members of your team to understand what motivates them and how do you get the best out of them in different circumstances.
100%. And really, so you're, in your framework of four things, you were talking about the context, and that what you're describing really is what Hersey and Blanchard back in the 70s wrote about initially, was situational leadership or contingency leadership, wherein we're considering not only the person and where they are in their capabilities, their understanding, their motivation, and other things, but also the environment in which they are operating and what is required of them in that. And so I think that understanding that is extraordinarily important with regard to being able to influence people in a positive way toward that common goal.
I talk to doctors a lot about this. In fact, the course that we designed that has been so useful has one of the 5-hour seminars is all about leading up. How do you get your boss to do what you want them to do?
Right.
And in many cases, physicians or healthcare providers are leading up to CEOs who are civilians and who are not part of the profession of medicine. So what a physician has to do, they can pound the table all they want and say, hey, don't you understand what I'm trying to get you to do? I want you to buy this robotic machine, or I want you to have different types of approaches to giving us the surgical suite to use. But they're approaching it from their perspective. And what you really have to do in order to flip the table and lead up is to understand what the other person is trying to accomplish and shape your message to what they're trying to do. So it's really, in some cases, understanding what your boss is trying to get done before you can help them understand what you have to get done.
Right. When I first talked to you, I was telling you about this idea that I have for interviewing 4-star officers and writing a book on their perspectives on leadership. And so I completed that as far as the interview process in the spring of 2023, and I've completed the manuscript, got a lot of adjustments to do and so forth. But something that really came out that I think is a very important concept for ourselves, for listeners, and so on, anyone who would endeavor to lead, is regarding communication and really understanding, just like you said, your audience. There's so much that goes into that. And Admiral Snuffy Smith, who passed away just last year, but he was one of the folks that I interviewed. And one thing that he said, it's almost verbatim the title of a chapter in my book, was, it's not what you say, it's what they hear. And when you frame that correctly, it's what they hear within their motivation, interest, desires, goals, so forth. And so I agree with you. It is imperative, if we're going to be influential to those, that we're leading, but those who are above us, CEOs and those types of people, it's understanding the kind of what's in it for them. What are they interested in accomplishing?
Yeah, no, that is exactly right. And for your listeners who think that Snuffy Smith is a made up name, I got to tell you, he is one of the greatest leaders that the Navy ever had. But he brings a very good point, because as I was talking about those 4 elements of attributes and competencies, influence and context, in the competency category, I would place a leader's, one of the most important competencies is communication. And everybody thinks that's all about what you say, but it's not. And in fact, research has shown that it's a small percentage of what you say, a large percentage of what they hear, as well as your body language, tone of voice, facial expressions, techniques of communicating. All of those things play a part. And a great leader realizes that they have to master those things in order to be successful.
Absolutely. When I interviewed General Les Lyles, I asked all the 4 stars the same first question. What are the 3 most important leadership lessons you learned across your career? And General Lyles said, communicate, communicate, communicate. Those are his three. And then, of course, he expounded on, but and numbers of others include communication. So I agree completely with you in that's vitally important. Just curious, and I'm sure that others listening would wonder this too. How does the commander of United States Army Europe move into the healthcare space? What sort of led to that?
Well, it's a long story. I'll try and make it short. But right before I was retiring, I happened to link up. I was in the Netherlands. It was Memorial Day, and I was going up to give a speech at one of the American cemeteries in the Netherlands, or actually it was in Luxembourg. I called the ambassador and said I was coming up there to give a speech. We had become friends, and I said I'll just be in your area. And he goes, "Oh, that's great, Mark." He says, "Why don't you come? I'm having a dinner on Memorial Day night." He says, "Why don't you come over and join some of my friends?" We went up. I met his friends at the cemetery before I gave the speech. I didn't know about any of this. This was all very serendipitous. But the friends of his who had come to spend some time with him they were a CEO and the COO of the hospital, and here in Orlando, Florida, where I live now. And they had thought of this new initiative that they wanted to begin. They took the details of this initiative to a colleague that worked over at Disney. At the end of briefing this colleague, the senior vice president of Disney, they said to him, what kind of guy should we hire? What kind of person should we hire to do this? And the Disney senior vice president said, hire a retired general. Now, this was a healthcare organization that was faith-based, didn't have a whole lot of connections to the military. So they were kind of shocked by that. Well, the senior vice president then gave them a bunch of reasons why they should hire this retired general. And so when I gave this speech, the CEO was sitting next to the ambassador and said, he leaned over to him and said, "This is exactly the kind of person that Disney said we should hire." And the ambassador, who knew I was getting ready to retire, he says, "Well, why don't you talk to him? He's retiring in a couple of months." So they came up to me and they afterwards at dinner and they said, "Hey, tell us your story." So I kind of told them what I was doing and how I was about to retire in 2 months or 3 months, I guess. And he said, "Well, would you be interested in coming to work or maybe coming down and seeing what we're doing at this hospital and maybe coming to work for us?" And it shook me. I mean, these are how these kind of things happen. And I said, you know, I'm a tanker. I'm not a doctor, right?
Right.
And he says, "Oh, yeah, we know we have this initiative." And he explained what the initiative was. And he says, "We think you'd be good in doing it." Truthfully, Tom, I thought he was crazy. Now, I have a little bit of background in health because I have a master's in physiology, but nothing like a doctor. Mm-hmm. And so I went to this hospital after I retired, took a look around, saw that their values and their people kind of reflected what I had been used to in the military, and went to work for them. Working on this initiative that was very different than the leadership piece. I had been there about 4 or 5 months, and my office was right next to the chief medical officer, a guy named Dr. Dave Moorhead. And he used to come in my office all the time and tell me about some problems he was having with doctors or nurses and how things just weren't happening the way he wanted it to. And he would always end with, "How would you deal with this in the Army?" So I'd give him some solutions and he'd go out of the office and sometimes would apply them. Well, one day he was in there and he says, "We've been trying to get a leadership program for our physicians, and we've tried all different kinds of methods and they haven't bought into anything we've been trying to do." He said, "Do you think you could put something together and, maybe teach a class as an additional duty?" So I did. I put the model together for an 8-month model. Came back to him. Both he and the CEO loved it. So we tried it within a couple months. And what we saw by just introducing the basics of leadership, not medical leadership, not having anything to do with, how you operate or how you treat patients or anything like that, but just how you lead teams and organizations and people, it seemed to indicate we were having some success in transforming the culture and one of the objectives of the course was bringing physicians into decision making, giving them a seat at the table in this healthcare organization. We did some research a couple of years later and we saw that what we were teaching and how we were teaching it, and how we were mixing in the course doctors, nurses, and administrators, because we wanted to build a team effort, was having an effect on transforming the culture of the organization. And we have done a whole bunch of additional research on it since then. And what we found is not only does a course that has specific objectives improve physician and healthcare leaders' ability, but it also gives them a greater affiliation with the hospital. It reduces burnout and several other things. So, and it creates stronger teams. So that's how it all started back in 2014. And what I found was, as I got older, I was more passionate about the leadership elements. The hospital asked me to write the book that you just showed, and I never thought that my first book after retiring as a 3-star would be about doctors, but it was, and it did pretty well on the market in the healthcare genre, and here we are. That's the long story, and I'm sorry for boring your listeners with that.
No, I mean, if they found it as interesting as I did, then I'm sure they weren't bored at all. There are a number of things that you brought up that I'd like to touch on. The first, most proximate to what you had just said, was regarding this idea of burnout and, how leadership can impact that. And in fact, Dr. Tate Shanafelt is the world authority on physician burnout. He's at Stanford University, and we're friends, and he's actually going to be one of the guests on The Science of Leadership later in a few months. And so I'm excited to have him on. And he actually has developed a model of leadership for physicians that is directed at reducing burnout. And he's done a lot of work on that. So that's exciting. Look forward to having him on. I think you'd be very interested in his work and hearing what he has to say when that comes out. The second thing, which is divergent from that, but you hit on this idea of serendipity, and I feel somewhat compelled to kind of share some research that I did when I was at Stanford, where I investigated physician leaders at Stanford and looked at how they became successful. What do they, in interviews, what do they talk about with regard to the drivers of their success? And one of the things that kept coming up in the transcripts was this idea of luck, serendipity, fortune, so forth. For me, that was dissatisfying because I can't codify that in a way that I can teach people, here's how you just be fortunate, right? But then as I did the analysis, what I really found was serendipity was this intersection of things. And one was, and there are 3 P's and then C's in the thing, but the 3 P's are position. You're in the right position, right place, the right time, that something happens that you can grab hold of. Preparation. So you've had the training, the experience, whatever is needed to actually do the job, undertake the task. And then the third thing is promotion. And promotion is the idea of, maybe it's a mentor who says, hey, Hertling is the person. Or it may be the mentor saying, Hertling, you are the person. Go do this. And so as you were describing, and then the final thing is actually grabbing the thing, right? A lot of times those 3 may come right to someone. Here's your opportunity, and they pass on it. Yeah. And then the repercussions are, that they don't move forward, they don't advance to something that could have been great. But anyway, so it's those 3 P's: preparation, position, promotion, and then seizing it. And as you were describing how yours played out, you were prepared by all of your experience leading in the military. You were in the right place, right? Because you were giving this speech and the folks were there in that moment. And then you had this person who leaned over and said, hey, this is the kind of person that other guy from Disney said we needed to get. And then when they came, as you said, it was like, this is totally out of my wheelhouse. I'm a tanker.
Yeah.
But still you went after it, and here you are.
I would buy into all of that. I might add to that, there's that old expression, I'm sure you've heard it, that you make your own luck.
Right. Exactly.
Part of making your own luck is engaging with others, and it doesn't have to be for a specific person, a specific purpose. It doesn't have to be sucking up to get something. It's just being a good person,
right,
and finding value in all the people you engage with. I didn't tell you the whole story. If I can add one more
sure,
dynamic to that story of me, being thought kindly of by those people with the ambassador. When he said that he was bringing some friends, I said, well, who are your friends? Just, we were having a conversation. He goes, oh, there are a couple of people from a hospital in Florida. He says, but one of them lost a son in Iraq. And that's why his son was a soldier and was killed in Iraq. And he says, and that's why I want to bring him to the Memorial Day service. And I said, oh, gee, that's horrible. So he's a Gold Star family. And he said, yeah. I said, when did they lose his son? And they said, well, early part of 2008. And I said, well, gee, I was in Iraq the early part of 2008. Do you know when this, what's the guy's name? And so he gave me the name. And Tom, I'll bring this over real quickly to you and show you. I have a box on my desk, and it says, "Make it matter."
I know where you got that.
I think I've told you about this. So when this guy gave me, or when the ambassador gave me the guy's name that was coming, it was a name that I remembered from a soldier who was part of my command that was killed in Iraq. Mm-hmm. So I went through my box that has, I'll lift it up a little bit so your viewers can see it, that has 253 cards with pictures in it.
Yeah.
And of those individuals I lost under my command in combat. And I look at this box every day and pick a couple of cards out and think about them and say a prayer for them. But by coincidence, this guy who was coming to the Memorial Day service was the father of one of the guys that I wrote a letter to. And he probably didn't even know who the heck I was at the time and forgot about the letter. So I pulled the card out and I went took it with me to that service. And when I met the guy, I said, "Oh, yes, sir, I know you very well. In fact, your son made the ultimate sacrifice." And I pulled the card out of my pocket and said, "Here is your son, and I want you to know that he's never forgotten in terms of my eyes." Well, you can imagine the effect. That small thing that I did had an enormous effect on this guy and his wife, that someone else had remembered their son. So the point I'm trying to make is being serendipity and luck also depends on engagement and treating all people with dignity and respect and knowing what is within the internal being of everyone, that everyone has a story. And if you can pull that out, the other piece that I can only beat the drum on is, and I think you would term it mentoring and pushing people forward. One of the organizations I work with, I'm sure you've heard of it, is a group called Women in Medicine.
Yes, sir.
Out of Chicago. It's run by a Dr. Ashika Jain. And she is really pressing the fact that you not only have to make your own luck, but men specifically have to help make the luck of women in medicine, because there's a lot of talent out there that isn't being seen because they're not being pushed forward by the majority of men who run healthcare organizations.
Yeah. The last 4-star that I interviewed was General Dempsey. And so he told me about the origin of Make It Matter. And he, like you, he actually, during the interview, he reached into his pocket. He said, every day I carry 3 of these cards. And he pulled out the 3 he had for that day and showed them to me. And so he had an influence on you, because I know you worked immediately with him. And because he mentioned you when we were talking, is what General Vince Brooks, who will be on the show next week, when I talked to him, he said, think about the wake. And as a swimmer, you would get that sort of idea. But it's, as we're casting this wake behind us, there are folks who are entrained, who follow in behind us, and we cut the tension and we remove the debris, and they're able to move forward easier. And so this idea of thinking about the wake and really having that influence that stretches sometimes much further than you would imagine is really a great one when we're thinking about being leaders. And it gets right to your point with regard to those people who historically have not had the opportunities to move into leadership positions or things of that nature. We need to think about our impact. What are we leaving behind us?
I tell you, Tom, if you've talked to Marty Dempsey and Vince Brooks, those are, I'm sure, two of the best that you've talked to, because both of them are my personal heroes. They're part of that pantheon of great people that I've had a chance to work for and with over my career. And, there's a little bit of luck in that too, and serendipity on who you get to work for
Sure.
and learn from, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. They were both great. General Dempsey, really, really hard to get in touch with. And General Brooks, who will be actually discussing servant leadership and the power of servant leadership when he comes on the program. There's something about his presence. We talk about presence, command presence in the military, and there's just something about his presence that I've, as soon as we started talking, I was like, I'll follow this guy. Wherever he says we need to go, I'll go.
Yeah.
Spectacular.
He does
person.
not make decisions lightly, and it's for the good of his people and the accomplishment of the mission, which is critical.
Yeah. Well, I'm getting the sense we could just talk about all sorts of leadership things, but I want to, make sure that I am, keeping us guided and focused toward our goal. The question I have now, and you've hit on it a little bit with your 4 components, but trying to be more practical for the listeners, is, okay, we've got this idea about leadership and military leadership, quote unquote, but we're just going to call it leadership because we know that's what it is. How do you really implement that, whether it's in healthcare or other, but on a personal level? And then, in growing physician leaders, you have this nice table that talks about teams and how you build teams and things. So if you could kind of work through the individual and then the team component.
The most important part to me, and I'll go back to the beginning, because you try and do this every day once you've mastered the discipline to do it. And that is a continual assessment of who you are. It has to do with an assessment of what you think is your character, what you hold true as your values, how disciplined you are in attempting to address those things on a daily basis, of living up to what you believe your character consists of and what you hold dear, because your character is how you perform, and your values are they help you make decisions. They're the base of making decisions. So if you first take a look at that and say, this is how I assess myself. The second part, and this is, it gets directly to the word that you just used, because that's a big word that's discussed in that Army Field Manual we were talking about before. That's presence. So the first piece is your character, which consists of all sorts of things, of how you grew up, what did you talk about over the dinner table with your family, what who were your friends, how did they affect you, how did you build your character, what values do you hold dear. That's who you are. But then there's that second piece of presence, which is how other people see you. And one of the key characteristics of a good leader, in my view, is does how you see yourself and how other people see you overlap.
Sort of integrity of those.
It's the kids today would say it's being real. It's who you are matches who you want to be and how other people see you. And then the third area of those attributes in that first element, in my view, is your intellect. How do you see the world? what helps you make decisions on your worldview and how you engage with others, your interpersonal skills.
Mm-hmm.
All three of those things, your character, your presence, and your intellect, are something that you have to reassess on a daily basis. When you look at the second element, your competencies, it's how do you lead?
Mm-hmm.
How do you communicate? How do you do things? How do you walk among people? How do you, what's your facial expression like? Are you smiling? Are you upbeat? Are you down? Or, you go around kind of with a dowdy look or whining or something.
Mm-hmm.
How do other people see you leading? How do you build teams, in terms of treating all people the way they should be treated? And if they're not living up to your standards, how do you get them there? And if you determine one day you can't get them to your standards, then you have to dutifully let them go do something else in a very nice way.
Huge task.
But then the third thing is, how do you make stuff happen? So those 6 areas out of those 2 elements of attributes and competencies, to me, are very important. But they require, Tom, a continuous self-assessment
Mm-hmm.
every day. How am I doing things? Am I doing things wrong? Am I showing my bad side when I really want to show my good side? Am I really taking other people into consideration? Am I living up to my values, or have I fallen off in that regard? So those are all, and it sounds hard because it is. I mean,
Sure.
this leadership stuff ain't easy.
Mm-hmm.
It requires a lot of work and personal reflections. Your second question of how do you build teams, I put that simple chart in the book as a start point,
Mm-hmm.
but it's really understanding the motivations of the people that you work with and who work for you. And it's determining, how do you provide a vision, give them directions, and really continue to assess what they're doing, for better or worse, to make the organizational goals come true. That's a continual process as well. But that gets into, the first part is leadership. The second part has a lot of leadership, but it also has a little bit of management to it as well.
Sure. Yeah. And I actually have written a paper where I differentiated leadership and management and published that as an instrument. So I don't want to, I can get going on that pretty easily. But one thing that I've heard in your comments, and we haven't stated it, I think it bears stating, is know your people. This idea that you need to know their capabilities, you need to know something about them as people, right? Like, where are they from? What's their story? You mentioned everybody's got a story. What is their story, and how does that story impact their ability to carry out whatever it is that they're trying to do? And then another thing that you were mentioning, I started thinking about emotional intelligence, right? It's understanding how you're coming across. That's part of that presence. How are other people receiving me? And so really this idea of know your people, and that was a theme that came up repeatedly in my study of the 4 stars, the imperative nature of that. And it leads me to a question. And that question, there's a little bit of a preamble. In medicine, in academics, and in other domains, but since I'm an academic physician, I can speak about academic medicine. But in academic medicine, there's this notion that you shouldn't get too close. You shouldn't have any personal connection with the people that you lead. I'd like to get your take on that. I harbor a certain opinion on that, but I wanted to get your take.
I think you're talking about the conundrum of fraternization, of getting too close. There's a huge difference from wanting to know who your people are versus inserting yourself into their lives. It is a requirement of leaders to know what motivates the people that are part of their team. And in order to do that, you really got to find out about their family, about what their hopes and dreams are, what really influences them in a positive way in terms of recognition. There are some people that don't like to be stood up before a crowd and say, hey, this person's the greatest person on earth.
Sure.
There are others who demand that, who really need that for whatever reason. But that's very different than inserting yourself and getting too close into their lives and having, a charismatic advantage over them. And the elephant in the room is, how do you stay away from starting personal relationships that are different than professional relationships? And what's interesting, and I'm sure you've seen this, Tom, there will be some who will mistake your caring for them and their welfare for being more of a personal caring. And that's when it gets dangerous. So I got to tell you, that's a fine, and maybe I'm talking in tongues right now, but that's a fine line that every single leader has to address. And you can't allow members of your team to overstep bounds. And by the way, you can't do it either. I was listening last night on the news. It was focused obviously on Vice President Harris and some of the other people that were part of her circle, talking about how President Biden found out about an illness or a death in the family. And here's the president of the United States calling that person up and saying, hey, I just heard your mother died and it's horrible and all this other stuff. That's the personal touch.
Yeah.
That's very different from saying, can I drive you? Well, I won't go into example because there's no good one, but that's the thing of true caring for the welfare of that person and to help the success of that person if they deserve it, versus trying to intersect in what they do. I did a drill. I started a drill as a lieutenant colonel when I was in command of a cavalry squadron that I read about in a magazine, a business magazine actually, that asked the question of your team, who lit your fire in your life? And what I found when I'm in an audience of 50 doctors and nurses and I say, close your eyes for a second and think about the one person that lit your fire. Okay, now open your eyes. I immediately say, open your eyes. And it hasn't failed me once, but in just that split second, everybody can think of at least one person that had a tremendous influence in their life. And when you dig deep into that, what did that person do that had such an influence? You normally find they cared about me, they held me to tough standards, they gave me tough love, but it was because they wanted to make me a better person. To me, that really goes to the essence of leadership and getting to know your people.
Yeah, I agree with that. But when we think about those people who have the greatest impact on us as leaders, there is this sense that they actually see us as individuals, as people who are important to them and whatever it is that's occurring. And the people in life who have the most influence on us are the ones who care about us. My grandmother was a tiny little lady. She didn't lead anything. She didn't graduate from high school and so on. But the impact that she had on my life was enormous. And it was that caring. Now, it gets to this issue of fraternization and too close kind of relationships. And it's interesting, among the 4 stars, when I was talking with them, the number of times that love came up, the word love, which is pretty shocking, I think, to most people outside the military, in the sense that they have a certain view of what the military is that's informed by poor portrayals, I think.
Bad movies.
Right, exactly. And but the number of times, I mean, your Make It Matter box, General Dempsey's Make It Matter box, is in a sense a physical representation of you're caring. We can call it love, we can call it affection, we can call it whatever we want to call it, but it's that this person is a real person who has intrinsic value that I will give dignity and respect to. I will appreciate their sacrifice and their service. And oh, by the way, on my little card, it says, they graduated from this place, or they've got a wife and 2 kids, or whatever it may be. That sort of caring, which is in my study, one of the 4 big things that came out, was that caring about our people is invaluable.
Yeah. I can't reinforce that as much. And I would say it does go beyond caring. It goes to love. And I know, having worked for and with General Dempsey, he loved all the soldiers under his command. Mm-hmm. So did I. I mean, it wasn't just the box. We'd tear up. I'd tear up. I wouldn't say this about him. He used to kid me about always getting emotional at things like graduation exercises. When you see one of your team members have success, or they're getting married, or they're having their first child, that they're part of your family. I mean, they are truly part of your family. And that's, I think, a critical component of leadership, is having love for your team. And that gets them to the point where you're understanding who they are and what they do, and how each one of them, to paraphrase what you just said, has a divine spark, that they are a unique individual and they should be treated as such.
Yeah. That goes so far, I think, when it comes to leading folks, influencing them. Can you share with us a time when, from a leadership standpoint, you kind of messed up, learned a lesson the hard way that might be instructive to listeners?
Wow, there's so many, to be honest with you. There are so many things that, when you're talking about an entire career,
sure,
that you mess up. I don't want to single out one. I could, but it just has to do with feeling just a sense of remorse at the approach or the way you handled something, and thinking to yourself, wow, I wish I could do that better, or I wish I hadn't said those words, or I wish that I had been a bigger person. Every time, in terms of reflecting on something I did wrong, it was either because of ego, defensiveness, or a lack of knowledge that I refused to admit, that caused something bad to happen. And there's a great book a guy just sent me a couple months ago to review for him, and it is I've been kind of messaging it. It's called Generals and Admirals, Criminals and Crooks. And what he does is he takes 7 case studies of senior ranking generals. Some of them we all know. I mean, they're very famous, and talks about how their ego, or their lack of attention to detail, or their straying from their values. 7 different case studies in terms of how they really screwed up. I could write my own book on some of those screw ups, but that's what I'd say to you.
Yeah.
It really centers around ego, discipline, or defensiveness.
Well, I think that you're in a group of greats that is able to say a lot of the leadership lessons I learned the hard way. There were numerous 4-stars who did that.
I mean, when you asked me the question a minute, I had 6 things flashing in my mind.
Sure.
I had a situation in combat where I made a huge mistake, and unfortunately, soldiers were killed. I had an incident where I went up against my boss and really said some things I shouldn't have said, because I was pissed and I didn't control my anger and my ego, and got defensive, and it cost me. There was another, you get the drift.
Yes, sir.
What I'd say is, any leader who says they haven't made mistakes, and they don't have a whole lot of scar tissue, and they don't remember those mistakes, in my view, isn't much of a leader. They may be in a leadership position, but they're not much of a leader.
Oh, you hit on something I think is vitally important. We got a few more minutes, hopefully, that let's just touch on that, because this idea of leadership versus leadership position, and that from my perspective, is extraordinarily important because there are so many people who are promoted into leadership positions who don't have the character, the competence, they don't care, they can't communicate. Those are the 4 C's in my book.
Right.
Um, and it becomes disastrous. And so I'd like to hear your thoughts on that leadership versus leadership position.
Yeah, and going back to that doctrinal manual that we talked about,
Mhm.
they actually define it. And they use different terms. They use formal leadership,
Mhm.
and that's granted to an individual based on the job or the position or a title, selection by a professional body, granting of authority. Those are all part of formal leadership. That person is the boss.
Right.
And you know that because they have the name on the door with their title right underneath it, and usually a parking spot outside if they're that driven by ego.
Yeah.
But then there's the informal leader. That's usually granted from, or it arises, it's not granted, but it arises from knowledge or expertise or experience or charisma, and it requires that individual to assume responsibility that they're not given. And it's not based on rank or title or position. And every organization has those. Every organization has the formal leader with the title, but there's a whole bunch of those informal folks who, truthfully, in good organizations, they're carrying the load. And the formal leader realizes that. I mean, as a formal commander, I knew that a bunch of sergeants and first sergeants and command sergeant majors had informal roles. They may have
NCOs
had a
get it
title,
done.
but they got it done. And they were doing it because I asked them to, or because they just knew it was the right thing to do. It's interesting, Tom, since your audience is a lot of physicians. Whenever I start my physician leadership class, usually on the first day, I ask the question, how many of you hold leadership positions? And the immediate thought is formal leadership, chief of the clinic, chief medical officer, whatever. And so 3 or 4 hands go up. And I say, really? I said, and I usually find somebody in the back who's wearing the doctor's uniform of the scrubs covered by the white coat with the stethoscope, who hasn't raised their hand. And I said, are you a leader? And he said, well, no, not really. I'm just a doctor. And I said, listen, dude, I'm telling you, as a civilian, when I walk in and I see that uniform, you're a leader as far as I'm concerned, whether it's formal or informal. So you got to act like one. So all of those elements of leadership that we talked about earlier have to be part of who you are. And I think you're either in a formal position or you're in an informal role, but everybody's a leader in one way or another.
Absolutely. I actually published a paper on that several years ago, talking about this idea that all physicians are leaders. And I mean, because, again, getting back to that initial definition that you share with us, it's influencing people, and people see a doctor and attribute certain things to that person and automatically then are influenced. If I tell you, hey, eat these gummy bears because X, Y, and Z, then you might actually do that because I'm a physician and you take me to know what I'm talking about. So I have influence on you in that way. And that doesn't get into the idea of you're leading a team. Let's say I'm taking care of kids. I'm a pediatric cardiologist taking care of kids with congenital heart disease who are in the hospital. Then I'm working with nurses and pharmacists and all sorts of personnel leading the team to try to take the best care for this child. And I think physicians often get lost in that because healthcare and academics are really hierarchical. And so in their minds, then it must be that leadership positions are leadership when that's not true.
Yeah. Well, that's another point that I'd like to make, if you'll allow me.
Sure.
And that is when I talk about in the very first class we have in every single cohort, I talk about the profession of healthcare. And in my view, in my humble opinion, there are a bunch of professions, there are only 4 major ones, and that's ministry, law, medicine, and the military. And there's a bunch of other teaching's a profession, engineering's a profession, journalism's a profession, but those are the 4 big ones. And of all those professions you could name, either the big 4 or all of them, there's only 2 of them that really deal in life and death. And that's medicine and the military. And they deal in life and death in very different ways. So what I think, going back to your very first question about leadership, leadership is so exceedingly important, more so in the military and medicine than it is in any other profession, because the consequences of getting it wrong by both formal and informal leaders is life and death.
Absolutely.
Right?
Well, General, I want to be respectful of your time. I really appreciate you coming on the Science of Leadership today and giving us just a little bit of your expansive knowledge on the topic of leadership, and especially talking with us about how do we bring leadership into medicine. It's been great to have you.
Well, Dr. Collins, it's been a pleasure, and thank you so much for having me, and thanks for all the things you're doing in trying to sing the song of leadership for others to start humming along with you.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Science of Leadership. We hope today's discussion has inspired you and given you valuable insights to help you become a better leader. Remember, leadership is about helping those we lead do great things. It's a journey of continual growth and learning. When we embrace that journey with curiosity, courage, and humility, we can confront challenges, overcome barriers, and foster environments where everyone can succeed. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow or subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with others who are passionate about leadership. Until next week, keep leading with character, competence, caring, and communication. This is Tom Collins. Let's keep growing.